author of The Sons of Achilles. And so she's a #1 a New York Times bestselling author. She's an Indies Choice Best Adult Fiction Year Award winner, as well as their audiobook. She's been shortlisted for 2019's Women's Prize for Fiction. She won the Red Tentacle Award. She won the 2018 Elle's Big Book Award. She is an Indigo here in Canada, our major bookstore. She's a Heather's pick. And I just read that her book is going to be adopted to, it's been adopted to 25 languages as a novel, but it's also going to be adapted to HBO. So we read about this book all the time. I see reviews on Goodreads and everywhere. So Madeleine, we were delighted it was a book that we had chosen and delighted that you are here today. So how are you? How are you surviving COVID?
I feel I'm doing well. I feel very lucky. My county I'm from Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. Our county was actually one of the earliest ones that went under lockdown. So we've been under lockdown for a while, and things are starting to slowly get back under control. But I feel so lucky.
Do you feel you're a little bit like Circe stuck on an island?
I do. It doesn't feel like an eternity yet, but it's definitely stretching into century feeling.
I'm sure. So I know you're a graduate of Brown University in the US. One of my best friends went there to school, so I know it's a fabulous institution. But if you can tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. So I majored in Latin and Greek, and I focused in particular on literature. I love the ancient epics, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and then the Roman epic, the Aeneid. And I had really loved these stories since I was a kid. My mom used to read me little pieces of Greek mythology and even little pieces from the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I totally fell in love. So I sort of knew all the way through that I wanted to study this, and I was fortunate to have some wonderful teachers, a wonderful Latin teacher who supported me and taught me Greek. So heading into college, I knew I wanted to study this, and then I ended up getting my master's in classics also. And when I graduated, I had been writing this whole time, but I had not been writing anything ancient. I had been writing totally contemporary stuff. My classics was here and my writing was here, and I never considered putting them together for many, many years. And so I went from my master's degree into high school teaching, and I taught high school for many years. I absolutely loved it. I learned so much, and I still miss it very much. But all the time that I was teaching high school, I was also working on Song of Achilles secretly, because I had finally figured out that maybe I could write about this thing that I had loved my whole life.
Wow. And I know a lot of our members that have loved this book, Circe, have gone back to read Your Son of Achilles as well. And for everyone that's on the line, I have some questions that have been emailed in. And then if you have any additional questions, you can put them into the chat. And then at the end, we're also going to do live questions. So if anyone wants to ask their question live and speak directly to Madeleine, we'll be able to do that. So if at any time you have any issues, just put a comment on the right, and I'll still keep trying to check it in between the questions. So Madeleine, so being a teacher, did you teach the Iliad and the Odyssey in your classes?
I did, although I was more often teaching the Aeneid, because my main thing that I taught was Latin, all levels of Latin, and then I did a little bit of Greek on the side for students who were interested. So I did get to read the Iliad with some students in Greek, but I also taught a little bit of ancient history, and so I would teach it in the context of that when we were looking at sort of the Greek and Roman world. I love teaching these texts, because one of the things that often happens is that students come in and they think this is going to be really boring, this is really old, this is really dull. But what they sort of quickly realize is actually this is, really exciting material. It's incredibly relevant material, and it's really intense material as well. It's, all about war and, parent-child relationships and love and death and pain, and it's really big stuff. And so I that was one of the most rewarding things, is watching students fall in love with the material too.
Well, I think a lot of our Girly Book Club members fell in love as well. And I have a question I'm going to read from my phone from Nicole Brand, who's one of our members. And she didn't put which city she's in, so I'm not sure from where, but she puts on her question, that she's read online that your first book, The Song of Achilles, was over the course of 10 years it took to write. So she was wondering whether you have adopted a similar approach when deciding to write Circe, and she's curious as to how long it took you to write this one. I think a lot of our readers are very curious about your work habits and how you research it and kind of where you get to when you get a completed book.
Sure. So Circe also took me a really long time, not quite as long as the Song of Achilles. Circe took me 7 years, kind of start to finish. Although in a sense, I think it had been like Song of Achilles. This was a novel I had sort of been building to my entire life, because I had been thinking about Circe since I was 13 years old, and I first read the Odyssey in English and was so frustrated that her part was so small. And I had this very intense reaction of thinking, like, she needs more airtime, which, I didn't know that would eventually become the novel Circe, but that feeling was kind of the beginning. And so 7 years for the actual writing part, but there was a lot of build up to it. I am a very, very slow writer. It takes me a long time to find the voice of the character, which for me is always the way into the story. I also have a background in theater, and I'm a theater director. And so I really need to be able to hear the character in my head. I need to almost put on the character and sort of wear the character almost like an actor would. And it's just a lot of trial and error. It's very, very messy. I try things out, I throw them away, I try them out, I throw them away, I feel despair, I say I can't get it, I come back to it, I do it again, and I can't even really articulate at the time what I'm looking for, but I'm just listening for that right sound in the voice, to get the right way that this character talks. And then once I have that, it sort of all comes at once. So that happened around year 5 of Circe. It was kind of 5 years of going down every possible wrong path before I got the first line of the novel, and then I kind of had it. And then it still took me 2 years after that. But so I'm a very slow writer, and I have embraced that at this point.
I think that really speaks to the thoroughness of the story that we get to read as the reader, because we obviously don't see all the pain and trials that you've gone through, but the language is so beautiful and so descriptive. And wanted to ask you about the tone, because did you particularly choose to have sort of a little bit of a Victorian influence and then a bit of modern, and how did you get to when you chose the voice of the character and this tone for the story? How did you arrive at that?
Well, I think looking back on it, again, at the time, I can't really articulate what I'm looking for. It's more like tuning an instrument that's sort of like, no, not quite right. But now looking back on it, I think what I wanted Circe to have this really direct voice, because she is a very direct person. She is earnest and she is honest, but at the same time, she was born in halls of eternal beings and, has lived for centuries. So I wanted there to be sort of this strange, a little bit alien, a little bit archaic quality to her language that sort of comes from that background. The fact that she is a goddess and has this sort of different conception of time. And I wanted that different conception of time to also inform the way she spoke and talked about time. I wanted her to be a very passionate person. I wanted her to be a person who, although she makes mistakes, she never gives up. That was one of my favorite qualities about Circe. So I wanted those things to all sort of be in her, folded into her language. But again, I can explain that now, but at the time, it's a little bit mysterious.
So there's a sidebar going on in the Google chat that's talking about her pronunciation of her name. So I know I've been saying Circe and you've been saying it, and Joanne is talking about there's a Greek pronunciation, is it Kirka? So did you research that? Did you look into what it's supposed to be, and what was it in your head?
Yes. So if I were teaching a course on ancient Greek, I would say Kirke. And modern Greek often says Kirki, because pronunciation has changed a little bit between ancient Greek and modern Greek, or how we have reconstructed ancient Greek pronunciation, because of course there are absolutely no recordings of ancient Greek at all. So where, scholars are just guessing. based on meter and sort of putting things together. So if you have been saying Kirke or Kirki, you are not wrong at all. However, what I do is when I write these novels, I try to use, because there are often different variations of the name, there's sort of the ancient Greek version, then there's often the Latinized version, and then things get even sort of changed again into English. So what I do is I use the most commonly known version of the name, which is why I went with Circe, because that's the one that I think the most number of people know. But you are definitely not wrong if you are saying Kirky or Kirke. And so, you know, I throw open the doors to that as well. But one of the things that I sort of try to be a little bit consistent. So if the name is known, I use the most commonly known version of the name. If the name is not known, then I go with the ancient Greek. So her island, Aiaia, I went with the ancient Greek version of that, not the Latinized Aiaia, which is A-E-A-E-A. So I have my own little system, which is sort of consistently inconsistent in how I do it. And one thing that I know sometimes people get intimidated about pronunciation, but as I said, there's no recordings of ancient Greek, so just go for it.
Well, and I was really grateful, and I'm sure some of our women are as well, to have at the back of the book, to have the glossary that had sort of the cast of characters, and then on your website as well, because sometimes I would flip back and say, okay, which one was that? And who am I reading about? So since there was, obviously she's lived a long time, so there's a lot of a cast of characters there.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm very glad. I'm very glad. That's the Latin teacher in me. And I never wanted people to feel lost or feel like they had to do homework before they had to read the novel. It was really important to me that that you didn't have to have a background in classics at all, or to know anything about the myths to read the novel. I wanted to sort of give people everything that they needed. One of the things that is kind of funny, the last thing I'll say about the pronunciation, is that sort of soft C, hard C thing is something that we've become really accustomed to when we talk about, say, Cicero. But his name really in Latin would have been Cicero. And, you know, same thing for Julius Caesar, it would have been Caesar. So would sound so weird to us, but it all would have been that hard C. So.
Well, and I guess that explains where Kaiser came from then, in German.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
And also the Russian word czar came from that.
Awesome. Look at this. You're still teaching, Madeleine. So we had a question from Jane Whitson, and she's asking, what sources did you use to research the myths? I know you'd cited some in the back of the book, but are there some key things that really helped you?
Yes, so there were 4 major myths about Circe that I was drawing on. And there are other sort of assorted, very small references to her here and there in other literary, in other literary pieces from the ancient world, but these 4 were kind of the major ones. So one of them is, of course, the Odyssey, the interaction with Odysseus that we see there. One of them was Ovid. It came from his Metamorphoses, which means the changes, the transformations. So the Metamorphoses is where all those myths of women being turned into trees come from. He tells all these stories of transformation, and so of course he has to include Circe, the great goddess of transformation. And the story he tells is the story of her love triangle with. Actually, let me stop here and ask: have most people who are here read the book? I don't want to put in spoilers. No. Okay. You'll know if you've read it. It's the love triangle between Circe, the god Glaucus, who used to be human, and a nymph whose name I will not say. That's the spoiler part. And how that love triangle sort of played out, I changed from the Ovid, but the idea of a love triangle I was taking from Ovid. Ovid's portrait of Circe is actually very flat and two-dimensional, and I would say actually ragingly sexist. It is sort of, she's the classic kind of woman scorned. She's always falling in love with the wrong guy, and then he rejects her, and then she lashes out. So, I sort of wanted to keep the fact that she makes a horrendous mistake there. But for me, what I was more interested in is sort of the psychology of what led her to that mistake, and also the fact that she then has to live with that mistake for the rest of her eternity. So the Metamorphoses was another major source. Then there was Apollonius of Rhodes' Argonautica, which is mostly focused on the story of Jason and the Argonauts and how Jason goes to get the golden fleece. But as part of that, he goes to get the golden fleece and he meets the daughter of the king who is keeping the golden fleece, who is Medea. The other great witch from ancient literature. And so Jason and Medea escape with the golden fleece. Medea and they, as sort of part of escaping, they do something rather horrible to Medea's brother. I won't say rather horrible, totally horrible to Medea's brother. And then they have sort of this blood pollution on their hands. And so they have to go be purified of this blood pollution. And so they go to Circe's island, and Circe is Medea's aunt. I knew, wow, the two great witches from ancient literature, I am not going to pass that up. It doesn't really go into their conversation or sort of what happens between them, but so that was really fun to sort of have that structure and then get to fill it with this conversation between the two of them and sort of how that would play out. And I see Medea and Circe as being kind of foils for each other a little bit, because they have both come from really traumatic backgrounds. But Circe has used her pain to sort of decide to reach out to other people, and Medea's pain has only made her more defended and more sort of hostile to other people and fearful of other people. So I sort of see them as, you know, choosing different paths, even though they have this similarity in their background. And then the fourth one of those, sorry, this is a very long answer. The fourth of those sources that I used is actually a source that we only have sort of a summary of. Now, the Iliad and the Odyssey were the two great ancient epics, and they were the most popular in the ancient world, and they're the ones that have survived. But there were a number of other ancient Greek epics that didn't survive. But we know that they existed because we have other ancient writers reference them. We may have a line or two here or there from them, or we have summaries of them. And so one of these lost epics is called the Telegony, and it is about Circe's son with Odysseus, whose name is Telegonus. Again, we're sort of a little bit into spoilery territory here, but it is 3,000 years old, so I'm gonna go for it, but try and be careful. And so Circe and Telegonus, Circe raises her son by Odysseus on her magical island, and he grows up, and when he comes of age, he wants to go find his father, who he has never known, and he goes off to find Odysseus. Some stuff happens, and Telegonus ends up bringing back to the island of Aiaia, where Circe lives, Odysseus's wife, Penelope, his brilliant wife, Penelope, and their child, Telemachus. So I knew that I was going to have Circe and Penelope meet in the last quarter of the novel, and that sort of meeting again between these two really interesting women, complex, intelligent, both artists, both really characters who have been kind of misunderstood, I think, and also characters who are survivors. They were both single parents, so they have a lot in common with each other, and I was really excited for that. And basically almost everything else was me sort of either making inferences from other myths. For instance, we know that Circe's sister was the mother of the Minotaur. There is no myth that has Circe appearing at the Minotaur's birth, but you know, if you have the opportunity as a writer to write a Minotaur C-section scene, I mean, I don't think you can pass that up. So.
No, absolutely not. You know, you talked a little bit about, as you talk about the characters, there's so many rich layers there that Joanne had posted out in the chat of how much she loved about the book. And Abby was asking sort of, is there anywhere in ancient Greek writings something to suggest a more sympathetic or human portrayal of Circe rather than sort of the harsh role that any of us that read Odysseus in school were more familiar with? Like, how did you arrive at creating her into this fully fleshed out woman with, you know, good things and bad things?
Yeah, well, in some sense, part of what I was doing was actually going back to Homer, because although she gets remembered, and I think the part that often gets emphasized about her in Homer is that she's so scary and she turns Odysseus's men into pigs, I would actually argue that the second half of the episode in the Odyssey is we see a totally different side of Circe. She says to Odysseus, you know, I see that you and your men are exhausted. you can stay on my island as long as you need to. And Odysseus takes her up on it. He stays on her island for a whole year with his men. And Odysseus spends the whole Odyssey sort of agitating and, desperate to get home. Circe's island is the only place he's not desperate to leave. And it's a really interesting sort of shift from how he normally is. In fact, on Circe's island, his men have to come to him and say, it's time to leave. And so that was very interesting to me too, that on some level, he feels some kind of home or kinship there. And then when he does go to her and say, okay, it's time for me to go, she says, great, here's what you need to know. And she starts sort of giving him all this really helpful knowledge. And so part of what I wanted to kind of push back against is the fact that oftentimes she gets taught as a villain, she gets remembered as a villain, and in later literature, she gets treated as a villain. But Homer's portrait is much more even-handed. And if you can sort of, setting her turning Odysseus's men into pigs aside, she is one of the most helpful characters that he encounters in the entire work. So part of what I wanted to do was kind of dig into that forgotten side that is suggested in the Odyssey, but then gets very quickly eclipsed by these villainizing portraits of her.
Well, and it's an interesting idea that you talk about, because a lot of women throughout the course of history and literature have been, it's sort of, they're either villains or they're these pure sort of, virgin like qualities. And I think reading this book now in an era of the Me2 movement, where women are finding a voice and we're talking about things that are happening to us, and we're talking about all the complexities that are part of being a woman, and that those are seen now more as acceptable versus being weaknesses. For me, I know I read Circe almost in a very different light. I know you said you were writing it over the last 7 years. Did the Me Too movement influence any of the writing style or the characteristics that you expanded upon in Circe?
I mean, for me, the work was a feminist work from the beginning, and I knew that I wanted to deal with some things that have been, part of, unfortunately, many women's lives for thousands of years. And so I wasn't actually, a lot of the issues that Circe faces and struggles with are all there in the ancient literature as well. Even if not about Circe in particular, they're all there with other female characters. And so I wanted to represent them and really dig into the fact that, this is the part about the ancient world that's kind of depressing. The nice part is, we've been here before, nothing new under the sun. Whatever we're facing, we have faced it before and we can overcome it. But the depressing part is, wow, we're still working on that. And it's been 2,000 years. And so I really wanted to highlight some of those things. And I actually, the Me Too stories were breaking pretty much as I was in like final edits, where you really can't change very much. And it was very eerie, actually, to be reading, a scene that I had written and then checking the news and then reading a scene and then checking the news. And just, I have always believed passionately that these stories are incredibly fresh and relevant, but it was a lot for me even to see it in that moment.
Well, it was almost a bit of foreshadowing, I think, on your part, coming up with that. And part of too, the other theme that popped out at me was also the sort of the family of choice versus family of birth. Yeah. Can you speak a little bit about how, if you knew you were going to take that approach and expand on that, a part of the story more, or what your thoughts were around that?
Yes. So one of the things that I love about the Odyssey is that it is this very human story at its core, that even though there are gods and monsters, really it's the story of this exhausted person who is lost and wants to get home. And I really wanted Circe's story in many ways to mirror that, except unlike Odysseus, instead of having a home waiting for him at the end of this journey, he has Ithaca, he has Penelope, his wife, he has all of that stuff. She doesn't have any of that. She is longing for a home. She's searching for home, but she doesn't have a home. She's actually in flight from her extremely dysfunctional home. So I wanted that sort of to mirror that longing for home, but what she really needs to do is sort of imagine what that home would be like and then find a way to manifest it and find it in the world. So that was very much part of her story from the beginning. There's kind of a throwaway description of her in Homer that describes her as the dread goddess who speaks like a human. And it's really just one word in the Greek, speaking like a human, audeessa. And it's very mysterious, and scholars have debated what it means exactly. But for me as a novelist, what that immediately suggested is this is a character who is caught between worlds. This is a character who was born a goddess, but has some piece of her that yearns for or belongs to the world of humans. And, you know, characters like that are always really wonderful to work with because they kind of stand outside of both worlds. They can reflect on both. And sometimes, you know, the story is that they need to find a way to bring those two worlds together. But with Circe, I felt that she was moving from one world to another, and that ultimately she would, you know, move away from her divine parentage. Because, you know, let's face it, if you, having read the book, or if you know Greek mythology, you know that the Greek gods are absolutely horrible. They are horrendous. They are sociopathic narcissists, really. And so, you know, that's who Circe is born into, but she doesn't identify with any of them. She speaks like a human. She has the ability, you know, metaphorically, to feel empathy and to want to connect with others and to care about other people, which I think are some of humanity's greatest traits. So
When you mentioned that she speaks like a human in the very beginning of the book, that for me set the tone going forward.
mm,
So that was such a fabulous way of saying it, I love that part, and I went back to reread it a couple times. That whole paragraph was amazing. But speaking back to family, so we have, it seems that a lot of our readers really liked in the beginning Circe's brother, and I'm going to mispronounce this probably, Aeetes.
you got it. Yeah.
And he apparently, Gina had mentioned that he was very wise and kind as a child, but then obviously we know he abandons her and transforms into a much less kind adult. Can you expand a little bit about that? Because we've got some other members that also are interested in that and want to know sort of, did we miss something out that hinted at his true character? Or was it his destiny?
Great question. Thank you so much. And I really enjoy talking about Aeetes because I think he's a really interesting figure in mythology. So he is actually also referenced in the Odyssey very, very briefly as Circe's brother. And he's described as Aeetes whose mind is bent on destruction. That's all one word in the Greek. Aeetes whose mind is bent on destruction. And I just thought, wow, what would it be like to have a brother like that? And so that was sort of always in the back of my mind, that we were heading for Aeetes whose mind is bent on destruction, and an Aeetes who could raise the Medea that we see as well. That I was sort of taking a little bit of my cue on what he was like from how Medea ends up approaching the world, because she is still very young when we see her. You know, she's a young teenager when she escapes from his land with Jason. So those were two things I was thinking about. But I also really wanted Circe to be, you know, one of Circe's great gifts, which is also really challenging for her, is that she is trusting. And she sometimes makes mistakes in her judgments about people. And I wanted her to have missed it a little bit. I wanted there to be, you know, some very small things in terms of how he treats her, particularly when he sort of comes back and sees her, when he shows up and says, oh, finally you are a witch. So I wanted there to be some very small sort of little things, but that mostly she loves him and she trusts him and she sort of fully invests in that. And I think part of Circe's journey is sort of figuring out, well, I've been burned all these times. How do I keep trusting? Should I just stop? Should I just stop entirely? Is that the answer? Or is the answer some other way? So he was a very important character for that. I also wanted him to change a little bit. And I think that one of the things that we have seen again and again, and this sort of goes back to the gods being sociopathic narcissists, is that psychological studies have shown that if you are, you know, if a person is sort of suddenly given all this power and all this privilege, and basically they don't have any sort of controls on their behavior anymore, their empathy starts dropping. And it's possible to wrestle against that, studies have shown, but you have to actually want to stop that from happening. And if you don't, then that's what will happen. And that story has always interested me. It's actually the story of King Lear as well. No one has told King Lear no for 80 years. And the first time someone tells him no, he blows up his family and has this epic series of tantrums. And eventually he sort of comes to realize, oh my gosh, I haven't been paying attention to the poor people in my kingdom. I haven't been doing what I should have done. And he's able to come back to his humanity because he is, in the end, human. But Aeetes, I think, doesn't necessarily want to wrestle with that. And as he becomes this incredibly powerful, sorcerer king, he's actually finds that power suits him really well. So I kind of wanted to look at both. I think Circe misjudges him a little bit, but also, that he changes over the course.
I think that's one of the things that I enjoyed reading the most about the novel was the fact that these are fully fleshed out characters, because otherwise there could be very one-dimensional where they're all good or all bad. And Odysseus is also one of the other characters that I think a lot of our readers really liked having as a fully fleshed out character. And Natalie had mentioned in the chat about, unlike the hero of popular mythology, where we don't see a lot of that, it's more one note. What made you develop his character in the way that you did?
So just like Circe has sort of been treated very badly, I think, by history, Odysseus has been treated very well by history. I would say that the Odyssey, which is, that's, if you're going to read about Odysseus, you're going to read the Odyssey. That is the most positive portrait of Odysseus from the ancient world, and even that is not that positive. But all the other versions of Odysseus are almost always negative, because the ancients really saw him as a liar. And so he shows up in a lot of tragedies where he's pretty much straight up a villain. Even in the Iliad, we see him in a much more villainous light. His sort of portrait in the Iliad, he goes on a night raid with his buddy Diomedes. They find a bunch of, sleeping, unarmed Trojan allies, and they decide to slaughter them all. Now, that is how you win wars. Odysseus is the great pragmatist, but it's extremely dishonorable, and it's not the sort of behavior that you would imagine from, Achilles possibly, or Ajax. And so I wanted to bring in the Iliad Odysseus, and I wanted to bring in these other sort of voices from the ancient world. So all the things that he does in the novel, the stories of him sort of doing something horrific, are all from somewhere in ancient mythology. They're from other versions of his character. And I have always seen him as sort of the great chameleon, that he shifts depending on who he's speaking to and what the situation is. And he is very pragmatic, which can sometimes also shade into amoral. And I'm fascinated by the fact that, but he is not, evil. He's not a villain like Agamemnon is. He has this amazing wife that he is sincerely devoted to, despite the fact that he sleeps his way across the Mediterranean. We won't go into that, but he truly seems to love his wife at the end of the Odyssey. And he formed sort of sincere connections with people. So I was really interested in that complexity, and also in sort of what the effects of 20 years of war and suffering would have done to him as well. 10 years of war and then 10 years of suffering, and sort of what happens, to a person who has lived through something like that. When he leaves Troy, he has 12 ships filled with men that he has been leading through this whole long war. And when he arrives back on Ithaca, he arrives home alone. They are all dead. And what it means to have seen, everyone from that time in your life die. So I wanted there to be a little bit of PTSD in there, which the ancients definitely wrote about, even though they didn't have that name for it. So I really wanted it all to be in the mix. I wanted him to be a very, very complicated character, and everyone sees him a little bit differently.
And with Circe herself, as you were writing, you already knew what the story arc was going to be, because from the stories of mythology what was going to happen. Is there at any point where, if you were writing her story, that you would have changed her arc, or introduced a different character, or introduced a different part of her life? Or basically, is there a rewrite of Circe that you would have included?
So actually, I did make a huge, huge change to the end. And I can't totally say what it is without wrecking the ending, but I will tell you the myth that I didn't use. So the myth that we have about sort of Circe's final end is that when her son Telegonus brings Penelope and Telemachus back to the island of Aiaia, Circe marries Telemachus. Penelope marries Circe's son Telegonus, so they like swap sons, which is very strange. And then Circe makes them all gods. And I knew from the moment I read that, I thought, no way. And I felt that I sort of had that, immediate rejection of that version of the story. And I think I had that for a couple different reasons. First of all, even though there are gods and monsters in my story, I really want the story to feel realistic. That felt more like sort of this totally unearned, wrap it up in a bow ending. It felt like it almost broke the rules of the world. So I knew I didn't want that. I also knew I didn't want Penelope's story to end with marriage. The obsession with her in the Odyssey is what man she's attached to. So I wanted her story to end with something that was just about her. I also never saw Telegonus as straight. And luckily there's a competing myth about Telegonus going off and founding a city in Italy. So I used that instead. But also I talked a little bit about how I saw Circe moving sort of away from the world of gods. And so I wanted to lean into that a little bit. So I did change things where I wanted to. And maybe the other biggest change that I made was actually in the section with Odysseus, because in the Odyssey, what happens is that he pulls his sword on her and threatens her, and she screams and falls to her knees and begs for mercy. And I thought, my Circe is not going to kneel to Odysseus, and that was sort of part of what I had felt so strongly about when I was younger reading that section. But I also kind of feel that the Odyssey was inviting me to change things a little bit, because the Odyssey, the Circe section in the Odyssey is actually narrated by Odysseus himself. He's telling it to a bunch of people that he's staying with, who he's trying to impress. And as soon as you realize that, and as soon as I started reading the Circe episode in the Odyssey in that light, I was like, oh, wait a minute, this is totally self-aggrandizing. Oh, there was this terrifying witch and she totally got the jump on my men. But then I tamed her, of course, and she threw herself at me and she was very hot, which is what he says over and over and over again in that section. He talks about how beautiful she is and how fabulous she is. So I thought, okay, this is Odysseus's, burnishing his own legend. He's had the chance to tell his version of the story for 3,000 years. How would it look now from Circe's perspective? So I wanted to push back a little bit and change things, in the sense of saying, okay, that's the male heroic tradition version. Now, how would this look if you were a woman who really lived through it?
Well, and I didn't even realize you changed it because it all flowed so well. And a lot of our readers are also saying the same thing. They saw a little bit of where it could have gone and we're super happy with where it went. So,
oh, good. I'm so glad.
Apparently what you retold fits. And I'm glad you picked that mythology, that portion of it. Now, if you were a god, if you were immortal, what powers would you give yourself?
Oh, I mean, I think I have to go. I think I have to go with Circe's power, which is not divinity. It's witchcraft, which for me, I love the fact that her power is really an art. It's about skill and dedication and passion and knowledge and experience. It's not, that kind of power. But I love transformation. I think transformation is a wonderful gift to have.
All right, so we've moved on to the Q&A thing. I think transformation is one that I would love as well. I think especially right now during times of COVID. Mm. So let me just type in here. So I know we've got a question from Kate. So let me just unlock Kate. Hold on one second. I'm gonna put everyone up, okay. So Kate, oh, I'm not unable to unlock you. Let me see if Valerie, I think because now I'm logged in as myself.
I've got it.
Valerie might have to unlock. So hold on one second.
Kate, I think I heard you.
Oh,
yeah, I think I'm muted. I'm good.
There we go. Perfect.
Hello.
Great.
Hello.
It's all yours.
You. Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. It's lovely to meet you. Really, the book was so wonderful and it made me feel good about being a human. Um,
Thank you.
it's kind of a twofer question. First, I guess, without spoiling anything, you kind of left the book on a cliffhanger. There's a bit of that. And everybody's got their own interpretation, but was that a difficult decision as a writer to end it like that?
So for me, I really wanted the book to end on a leap of faith. I feel like that Circe has spent much of the novel doubting herself, and she finally comes to terms with that sort of that doubt. And that to me was the most significant thing. And I think people can definitely interpret it different ways. I'm one of those annoying writers that feels like once it's out in the world, it belongs to you as much as it belongs to me. So you can all have your own endings, whatever you think happened. But I wanted to end it on this act of faith in herself.
Yeah, that's great. The other question was when you were talking about finding her voice and the 5 years, I imagine that being, how was that process,
Very messy.
Try.
I didn't intend Circe discovering her witchcraft on the island of Aiaia to be reflective of my creative process, but when I went back and read it, what I had written, I was like, this sounds familiar. So, this trial and error, this sort of having to figure out what you're actually trying to say, to go deep enough into the story, to move towards those moments of heat and to, let go of the things that are not interesting to you. So I didn't use absolutely every myth out there about Circe. There's one where she turns this guy into a woodpecker. I wasn't interested. So I let it go, and kind of giving myself permission to let go of the academic and be the novelist. And what is this thing that one of the sections that was so gripping to me early on was the scene with Trigon, and I'm gonna be very vague about it, but I will say that there's this detail in the telegony that she arms her son with a stingray tail spear, and I thought, wow, I don't know, something about that detail really got me. I thought it was such an interesting witchy weapon to give your child. I thought, there's nothing really else like that in ancient myth. And so I sort of fixated on that detail. I had no idea why, but then that detail ended up becoming one of the most important scenes in the novel. So I kind of have to just trust myself on the things that are, generating that kind of heat.
Kate, thank you for the great questions. Those were awesome. And Madeleine, what are you working on now? We're anxious to know.
So I have a couple of different things I'm working on. One is a short story on Pandora, who is talk about a story that is very relevant to modern times. Pandora gets blamed for everything because she's just too curious. So it's kind of an Eve story. It's kind of the Greek Eve story. I definitely want to write back to that. I'm also really interested in writing back to the Aeneid, which is sort of Virgil's version of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's kind of the Roman founding myth, and it's one of my favorite pieces of ancient literature. So I would love to write in its world. But actually, I mentioned my theater background. I direct Shakespeare plays. And The Tempest has been rattling around in my brain for a long, long time. And in fact, it was a little bit tangled up with Circe for a while. I had to kind of work on both of them simultaneously to untangle them, because The Tempest, if you know Shakespeare's Tempest, is also, islands and magic and witches and witchcraft. And so there's a lot of sort of overlap there. And so now I'm interested to see, well, what's left? What's left in that?
Well, we are certainly looking forward to that for sure. For sure. We have a question from Jill. Jill is one of our Girly Book Club members. So Jill, if you can unmute your microphone and go ahead and ask Madeleine your question.
Hi, Madeleine.
Hi.
Thank you so much. This book was great. I loved it. Part of what I really liked about the book was that I felt like I already knew a lot of the characters, so it made it seem more personal. But that kind of brought me to the question throughout the reading is, I don't have a background in the classics, and I haven't, other than my like public school education about Odysseus and how we were exposed, you know, then I didn't know how much of the book was the myths and mythology that you'd read and incorporated, and how much of the book was your spin. And so this question might be impossible, but is there, without reading all of the classics, is there, how would you, I guess, characterize what your spin is versus what is existing mythology?
So I think that I filled in a lot of gaps. So there are a lot of things that exist in the mythology. For example, Prometheus, the story of Prometheus bringing fire and civilization to mankind, and then being horribly punished for it by Zeus and chained to, you know, a mountain and having his, you know, an eagle come and eat his liver. That exists in mythology. And we have a tragic retelling of it from the ancient world, where Helios and Oceanus, who are Circe's father and grandfather, as other major titans, talk to him and interact with him, and they're part of his story. And so there is no story where Circe talks to Prometheus, but because her father and grandfather are so involved in the Prometheus story, there was a natural in there. So I was looking for things like that. So I wrote her into that story, but I always wanted there to be something, a reason to go there. I didn't want to be just saying, you know, and now she meets Pegasus, and now she meets Hercules, and now, you know, it had to connect in some way pretty tightly with the stories that already existed. The story of Daedalus and the Minotaur and the Labyrinth and Ariadne, all those things again were sort of there. Circe isn't mentioned in it, but the Minotaur's mother is her sister in mythology, and the Minotaur really is her nephew. What a strange nephew. And so, you know, again, I was kind of looking at that moment. But I like to write pretty close to the material, and sort of I like to mostly stick to the material, and then every now and then to kind of push back against something, like I did with Circe not kneeling. Otherwise, the scene is very, very close to what you see in the Odyssey. It's just that their sort of dialogue is a little bit different because we're getting it from Circe's perspective as opposed to Odysseus making himself look good. So, you know, it's those types of things. So in general, except for sort of moments where I'm pushing back and all the pushing back I'm doing is about treating Circe like a full person. Because oftentimes, you know, the voices we have from the ancient world are, with the exception of Sappho, pretty much exclusively male and aristocratic. So when we're looking at all this, you know, ancient literature, we're getting a very, very narrow band of perspective on these characters. And so I feel that the pushback I'm doing sort of falls in like, well, let's hear from someone else's perspective a little bit. So it feels like it's talking back to the material, not completely undoing it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Do you consider this a historical fiction? Because I will say at my local bookstore, it was in the fiction section, and I was a little disappointed.
It is. I mean, so it's kind of this weird. I have made up my. It's not really my own genre. I think it already existed, but the genre I imagine myself in is mythological realism. Where I feel like I am taking as much from history as I can. Almost all the objects that show up in the novel, the jewelry, the little pins, the cups, they all come from some sort of ancient inspiration. Either they are almost exact replicas of a real find that we have, or they're inspired by a real find that we have. So I'm doing a ton of drawing on the history. Circe's loom, the Egyptians really did have the best loom making technology, and I did a lot of research on looms. Only 1% is in the novel. You're welcome for that. And so, you know, I'm trying to bring in as much specifics as I can that really come from history, but there are also gods and monsters in my novel. So I feel like I can't totally call it historical fiction, but there is lots and lots of history and a lot of research and a lot of, you know, also me trying to get the plants that they used right in witchcraft and that kind of stuff. So, you know, the academic classic scholar side of me is always talking to me as I'm working.
I think it's true when you talk about the gods and monsters, and those are part of the book as well as the history. For me, it touched on so many different genres, including a little bit of fantasy as well, that it was a nice unexpected surprise to get into it, because I figured, oh, I know what this is going to be about, right? I read it in school like so many other people through the Odyssey, the story, and it was so different from what I'd expected. So I think that was a pleasant surprise. So Jill, thank you for the question. That was amazing and right on point. So our last question is, Madeleine, you've, over the course of writing these 2 books and going from being a teacher to, I think, a full-time writer now, and getting all these awards and accolades, how has your life changed from when you first started writing this book?
Oh my gosh. Well, it all feels very surreal. When I first wrote Song of Achilles, I really didn't think anyone who was not, blood related to me would purchase it or read it. And I kind of felt the same way with Circe. These were 2 stories that were so deep in me. They were so much part of my thinking. I lived with these characters for such a long time. And I think when you sort of, as a writer, you finish it and you put it out in the world, at least me, maybe there are some writers out there who are like, everyone's going to love it. But I don't feel that way at all. I think, wow, this has been inside and now it's walking around out in the world. And I have no idea if it's going to resonate. I just know that I have done the character all the justice that I can do them, that I'm capable of. But it is so meaningful to me to hear that the story has resonated with others. It just, every single time that someone says that to me, I am so grateful.
Well, Madeleine, we are extraordinarily grateful for your time today and for sharing with us not only your thoughts around the book and how you've put it together, but for really letting us into a glimpse of who you are and how you got to create this absolutely wonderful, beautiful work of fiction. So on behalf of the Girly Book Club, on behalf of all of our members, I just want to say thank you to everyone that's on the call. And Madeleine, thank you so much for being here this evening. And we hope to read your next book at one of our upcoming Girly Book Club books of the month.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for reading and for coming. This was such a treat.
Thank you. Okay, take care. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you.